Frank Spring, thank you so much for making time for our little program.
Thank you for having me, David. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. You cite the report deciding to win, and so we're going to talk about that. But this narrative that the Democratic Party is kind of too far left, it goes beyond. I've heard that outside the deciding to win framework, particularly from political scientists often that kind of talk about that, and others as well. So, and I've always wanted to have that conversation for a while. I've been meaning to have this conversation with somebody but nobody wants. It seems like they want to take the bait and have that talk. And because I know there is a faction, that sort of says, well, no, that's the opposite, right? That the party needs to go more left. So tell us a little bit about your research on this topic.
Sure. So my firm does deep qualitative research, and I could talk to you about the method. But essentially, what I'll say is that if you can imagine a group that's like a very large focus group, but the people never see each other, so you avoid the group dynamics. And it is a series of long, kind of individual, deep interviews that are conducted in chunks over a series of days with multiple people via digital platform. I could get into again, there's a lot more detail, but that's the basic methodology that we use. We use that, and there are other things that we do, but all of that data feeds into our narrative models. So we're sort of, what we are most compelled by is, what are the stories that people are telling themselves about their lives, their communities, their country. We did a number of these last year. Over the course of 2024, we've done some this year as well. In fact, we just finished one in Nebraska on Friday. So we've done we've done a fair bit of this work, and what we have seen out of this is uh, the idea of whether the Democratic Party is too left or too right, or whether the Republican Party is too left or too right. That frame is superannuated. It's old. It's outdated. It doesn't really work anymore. What we're seeing is that people are a lot more politically heterodox than we might expect, and that an assumption that left on social issues, right on social issues, left on economy, right on economy, that if that frame ever really described how people make decisions, it doesn't work anymore. And that came through very clearly in particularly in what we saw last year.
That's interesting because we've talked about that idea a lot on the show. We had on the Hiram Lewis, who wrote the book "The Myth of the Left and Right." We've had on
Mhm.
others like from the Independent Center and others. And we kind of like this whole paradigm's a little bit broken, but people seem to just be convinced that that's the reality or that's the way to think about the world. Um, what are some data points or something that kind of highlights that would make it kind of crystallize it for the average person to really see that it's
Sure.
not really relevant anymore?
Absolutely. So I'll give you one example from what we did last year. We did a study of Gen Z Latinos in the West, especially in Arizona, and we posed them a series of questions in which we asked the big question was, what is government for? That was that was the umbrella question, and then within that, we would ask them around a series of sort of technically policy areas, housing and education and a few others, but mostly housing. This group was particularly concerned about housing. We saw that for very early on, and they had a deep rooted worry about being able to afford a house when they got older, and there was a lot of anxiety about what we got a sense that there was a difficulty seeing having a place for themselves in the future, a place for the people that they care about. In many of them, there was a real sense of shame that they were not living up to the living standard of their parents, many of whom were immigrants to this country. And so the idea is, well, they did this, why can't I? So we were exploring. So housing, we hit that one particularly hard. But what we would do is we would ask them, what is government for, and what should government do about this problem? And then we would pose them 3 or 4 different policy options, but the point was not to say, oh, they like this policy option more than that policy option. We didn't ask them to pick their favorite. It was just, what would you say if we did this? What would you think if government did this? How would you feel about government doing this? And I think for housing, and what the point about all of the options that we presented on every policy area was, one of them was, at least one of them had to be quite what we would consider traditionally left wing. So spending a lot of government money, and or then there had to be one of them was sort of needed to be a little bit more kind of moderate. So there's some government expenditure, but it's moderated in some way. Then the last one was a free market answer, and where possible would also offer options that were government with its hands off and government with its hands on. So we were sort of testing appetite for spending and regulation, which we sort of see as being the kind of the two things that would sort of constitute a more left of center approach, versus not spending, not taxing, and not regulating at all. The government not getting very much involved in your life. So there's really a question of what do you think about whether or not the government should spend money, and how involved do you think the government should be in things? And what we found was the answers were absurdly heterodox. We had Republicans telling us, yes, I think the government should fund down payment gifts to people buying their first homes. Failing that, they should give low or no interest loans to people buying their first homes, and also the federal government should cap housing prices in certain zip codes, which is an absurdly interventionist approach to economics. That and again, these were Republicans. Democrats agreed with that as well, but we had Democrats telling us that it was on gun control, telling us that it was impossible to regulate. We shouldn't even try to regulate the sale of assault rifles, but we should. But they and independents and Republicans all said, but there should be mandatory federal psychological testing if you're going to buy a certain type of weapon, which is the sort of thing that would have made the John Birch Society faint away. It just so their views were. You could say they were remarkably inconsistent, but there was a very profound consistency to them, and that was a sense that politics was not working, and they were less interested in drawing lines, left and right on methodology than they were in someone doing something that worked. That was very clear to them. So that is, and we saw that kind of heterodoxy all over the country. I just remember those Republican kids telling me that the government needed to cap the price of housing, by fiat, and needed to give people money for down payments, which is a position that I think would have made Republicans, certainly of the Mitt Romney stripe, just faint dead away. And that did not bother them at all. And Democrats likewise held fairly what we consider conservative positions in other areas. So their heterodoxy is the order of the day. I think those old kind of party identification lines are beginning to break down.
Interesting. One thing that you talk about is that voters don't see the Democrats as too extreme, but they sort of don't know who they are.
Mm-hmm.
That they can't describe what Democrats are for. I guess what they stand for.
That's right. There was
Tell us a little bit about that.
There is a distinction there. So one of the challenges, and this is, I think, really what kind of led us into to dispute some of the findings in the Deciding to Win report that came out in October of this year, is that there is a sort of school of thought within the Democratic Party that Democrats talk too much about what are sometimes called social issues, right? That we talk too much about diversity or inclusivity, DEI, and that comes at the cost of it. That drives people away, and that comes at a cost to our ability to communicate with communicate with people and to build relationships with undecided voters. What we did find that, and we found this very consistently. This was truest among the young people, among Gen Z, but this was true across every every study that we did last year, and everything we've seen this year. That people have a very clear notion that the Democratic Party is for diversity, right? They know this. When we ask, what do you associate with the Democratic Party, and we've asked them to, bring together various pictures or record videos talking about this and to bring words and so forth. It was all around diversity. Democrats are for diversity. And the thing is, almost no one objected to that. We only found a few really rooted diehard Republicans who really had some objection to that. But even within the people with intact conservative political identities that we were talking to, for the most part, they actually didn't think that was too offensive. Everyone was pretty much on board with it. The problem is they didn't know what else the party was for. Once you got past that diversity layer, people were, one study would give us 9, 10 different answers of what the Democratic Party cares about. And that really is the problem, is that, and you could sort of look in the roots of the Democratic Party in the last 25 years. It's kind of uncomfortable relationship with capital, with working, with the concept of spending and regulation, right? Like, we've had a sort of very inconsistent and very uncomfortable relationship as a party in politics and in government with the economic side of this, with material politics, and that is appearing as an uncertainty. You can see that reflected in the uncertainty of, well, what else are these people for? Whereas the Republican Party very clearly they had a very clear image on them. They are not for diversity, and that was a real problem for everyone except those diehard Republicans. Republicans are very socially conservative. They kind of want to tell you how to live. That was a real problem for a lot of the people in our studies, especially those Gen Z kids. They really, really did not like that. But Republicans are for business. Like that was a very, very clear that just that they that was their most intact piece of brand. The biggest, the most resonant part of it is these people are they might tell you how to live, but they are for business. And the Democratic Party simply has not had a compelling answer for that, not because we haven't talked about economics, but because we haven't talked about economics and finance in the right way. The problem is when we start talking about how to solve the problem, how to address that problem, you get recommendations from, and Deciding to Win is a little less explicit about that, to their credit. And it is a very well researched piece of work. I want to give credit where due there. But the sort of more conservative side, more centrist side of the Democratic Party will often tell you the Democratic Party needs to move away, needs to move away from its left positions, its liberal positions on social issues, so we can talk more about economics. That, I think, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how people make decisions, because most of the people that we talk to actually favor diversity, and we're again in favor of it. Why would you abandon a position, leaving aside the moral element? Why would you abandon a position that actually is fairly popular when you could complement it with something else that that would fill in the gap that people have in their perception of your party? And that's where you sort of get into the way that people, particularly in my profession, sort of salaried professional political class, misunderstand how voters make decisions. They don't go down a list of policy proposals and say, well, these people are in favor of diversity, but they are also in favor of taxes, and therefore I don't like them. Therefore, it's a much more complex piece of identity, and the way people form their identities and the way they express those identities through voting behavior and allegiance. It's much more visceral, and it's much more rooted in it's much more values based, and to do with the stories they're telling themselves about their experience. And that just does not appear in that kind of, are Democrats too far left? Are they too far right? Are they too liberal on social issues? Are they not liberal enough?
Yeah, on that point, are there some other examples? Like you kind of, again, I hear a lot about the sort of DEI thing as being a sort of um, holding the Democratic Party back. Are, are there any other cases that you might say are sort of things that are seen as unpopular, but actually don't may not be as unpopular as people think?
Yeah, I'm happy to give you an example of that. One of the things that we did, we tested some ads during the 2024 cycle. And our method of ad testing is a little bit different. I won't get into the methodology of it, but we really want to understand people's responses. What parts of ads do they like? What if you're sort of taking something that is a typical message from a candidate or a party, what associations do people have for it? What stories does it call to mind? Do they start doing co-creative storytelling where they can kind of see themselves in the message of the ad? They can see themselves being part of it, or are they just repulsed by it? One of the ads that we tested was the infamous, "She's for Them" ad, the profoundly anti-trans ad that the Republican Party ran a lot of in 2024. Spent $275 million on ad buys for that thing. Were substantial post-mortems. You can see people know better saying, well, they ran that anti-trans ad and they won, so clearly there's something to it. What we found in our panels over and over again was even Republicans found the tone of that ad bullying and cruel, and they really did not land. The idea that and so the idea that there is something that you can kind of make political hay, that there is some political virtue in taking an anti-trans position. You see that pop up in Democratic circles less and less as pro-trans, pro-rights, pro-civil rights candidates keep winning elections, including very famously and most recently Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, absolutely hammered on this issue by Republicans all cycle long and cruised to victory. So did so did Mickey Sherrill. So like Democrats were not in the least bit burdened by any positive thing they've ever said about basic human and civil rights for trans people, and yet we have been told over and over again by people in my political class that this is really this is an anchor around the Democratic Party that we should get rid of, and there's just never been any evidence for it, and there's never been any sort of, to borrow a phrase, there's never been a mechanistic and explanation for why that would be the case, for why a large number of independent voters, of people who didn't already have really strong, intact conservative narratives, why they would be so motivated by that one issue to cast their ballot on that basis. There's never been an explanation for it, and there's never been an explanation in the data. It's just a myth.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because anecdotally, like you talk to conservatives, and for the most part, a lot of them are like, I don't care about any of that stuff. Like, do what you want to do, right? But they get it gets portrayed that they're super concerned about it.
Yeah, yeah, we didn't see that very much. We saw some people that took a kind of what you might say a sort of classically conservative model. Well, I don't like it, but they should be able to. I don't see why we have to be talking about it in politics. That was kind of the most conservative, articulation that we had from any of our panelists. For the most part, it just didn't land with them as an issue at all. And there is, I think, a very good chance. And I think it would be hard. I think one of the reasons why that sort of is often given more political salience, more credit for political salience than it deserves, is it's really hard when you lose an election like last year's, full stop. But it's also really hard when you lose an election like last year's, and your opponent appears to have spent $275 million on nothing. I mean, that's just an ugly reality to face, that they managed to throw away almost a third of $1 billion, and they still won. That's real unfortunate.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So
Yeah.
you mean the Democrats threw away all that money?
No, I mean the Republicans did. The Republicans spent $275 million in that anti-trans ad, and there's a very good chance it did nothing at all. So you're almost, I guess I'd say it's almost a quarter of $1 billion just absolutely flushed away, and they still managed to win. And that's a hard thing for people in my profession to accept. You kind of almost have to say, well, clearly it did something, because I mean, imagine how badly they might have beaten us if they'd used it on something useful. So I think that's kind of part of the reason that's given more salience than it's credited with, or that it should be credited with.
Right. I mean, a lot of the armchair, sort of quarterbacks or Monday morning quarterbacks of about the 2024 election, it often came up that, kind of this general theme of, the voters didn't feel like their concerns were prioritized, and the Democrats were prioritizing that kind of stuff, DEI and these other things, when they had economic concerns.
Yeah.
I mean, what's your thoughts on those critiques?
Technically true, but a misread of how voters make decisions, and also what their concerns were. If you set those two things up in opposition, it has to be one or the other. Then you are ultimately led to that conclusion. Democrats talk too much about diversity and not enough about the economy. The problem is Democrats actually talked a ton about the economy. Like, this was, and have been historically. Like, this is talking about the economy has been a favorite pastime of Democrats, but none of it cut through. And actually, over the course of the campaign, you can see that a concerted effort to improve how first the Biden ticket and the Kamala Harris ticket performed on the economy did actually raise the standard, did actually raise the sort of perception of both candidates in voters' eyes that they were better on the economy. It just ultimately didn't translate into the votes that it needed. But the bigger problem is, and some of this is a structural argument. I have a lot of time for the argument that the worst thing that the Democratic Party could have done to win the 2024 election was to win the 2020 election. That winning that, inheriting the inflation that followed COVID, and the disrupted supply chains and all the cost of living increases, I mean, that just knocked down governments all over the world. To a certain degree, there's a really good argument to be made that ultimately there wasn't that much that Biden or Harris could have done on the campaign trail. They would have had to have taken a completely different approach to cost of living in 2021 and 2022. So I have a fair amount of time for that argument. But ultimately, it's pretty clear, and you're seeing this now in the tanking support for the Trump project. I mean, this guy's in the worst position of any president in history at this point in his administration, including himself in his first term. That tanking support is very clearly indicative of kind of what we were finding, which is people were they were leery of Trump. Even the Republicans, we had Republicans who were really kind of doubtful about the guy. They were leery of him. We got a lot of people saying, God, I really hope he's more disciplined. I really hope he's more focused. I really hope he's not as antagonistic and nasty to people. But we've got to get someone in there who understands business. There was a sense, I think, with voters that like something is rattling under the hood of the economy, that people's fortune, it's too expensive to live, and you're not paid enough to make it. But mostly that it's gotten too expensive to live, and that we need someone who understands business who can get this in. And Trump has spent decades presenting himself as the business guy, the guy who knows dollars and cents. It's not true, of course. The guy lost money running a casino. I have no idea how you can do that, but he did. But he had spent decades building his own personal narrative, his own personal brand as the guy who knows about money. And when you got money problems, you vote for the guy who's got money. Those problems have not gone away, and he's done a bunch of other stuff that people really find repellent. And what we're seeing, again, I mentioned the panel that we just closed, the study that we just closed in Nebraska. conservative independents who voted for Trump, Republicans who voted for Trump, have moved away from being worried about him to condemn it to just being like, man, I do not like the way he talks about people. I don't like what he's doing. He's too, there's a real kind of rhetorical and aesthetic objection to him. But those concerns have gone from being something they were worried about to something that is now turning them against him. And I think a lot of it is the idea that he is now focusing on the wrong things and not fixing the stuff that they wanted to, which is that it costs too much to live in this country.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is always a good candidate when he's the when he's the
Yeah,
outsider, right? It's harder when
yeah.
he's the incumbent to sell the story that the government is broken when you are the government, right?
When you exactly, when you yourself are visibly breaking it,
Yeah.
and talking openly about it.
I know this is not exactly your area, the area you probably wanted to talk about, but since you're such an expert and I have you here, I'm curious about that narrative that Trump, is in one of the worst positions, of any president kind of thing. When I look at his numbers, he's always hovered around 40%. So he's not that much worse than he always has been. He never got above 50%, I don't think, the whole time in his first presidency. And he's always kind of just hanging around at 40%, and that's kind of where he still is. Now, some numbers I've seen that I would say make me look at that a little more seriously is, he was even at 40% or whatever, he always had kind of 90% support within the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen some numbers now saying that's fallen. I don't know how low. Some say like 70, some say 80, but somewhere in that range, it's gone down. And one thing I would say about that is if that starts to happen, then at least these um, Trump opposition narratives don't sound 100% partisan, right? It starts to be a little bit more of a coalition rather than just saying, well, that's just a partisan who's saying that because we still support him 90 something percent. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of that.
Absolutely. You are right. When Trump was in the 40s, it was kind of business as usual, or not business as usual, but pretty typical for him. There are a number of good quality polls that are showing he is now regularly dipping down into the 30s. Some of them have him in as low as 34, which is kind of catastrophe territory for any president. I know that when they were running for reelection, the Trump White House was especially concerned about 39. That was their red flashing light number, and he is very comfortably hitting that on a weekly basis, pretty much across the board, and in many good quality polls, substantially going below that. So, he is moving below his usual territory pretty regularly. The thing, and here I owe credit to the pollster G. Elliott Morris for talking about this. This is not an original thought to me. But the strength of his disapproval has always been extraordinarily high, or rather, the proportion of his disapproval that is strong disapproval is absurdly high. He came into this with 50% of the country rootedly against him from the start. That's a real bad place to start. You can get there if you have if you're having a bad time in your administration, but to begin from there, because that tells you like to win someone who has already made up their mind that you're a bad president, to win them over is an extraordinary act of persuasion. I don't know that at his best, and there was a time when he was, a gifted communicator in his way. It's funny to say that about a guy, but who was, often so apparently inarticulate, but he really was a very gifted communicator for the people that he needed to communicate with. There might have been a time when he was capable of sort of mending those fences and winning those people back, but whatever talent he might have had for that has substantially deserted him, I think. So, that's the other number that I'm looking at here is his strong disapproval. He is losing support among Republicans, and again, we just talked to a bunch of them in Nebraska, and I think, and for those who support him, their support is softening. There is this kind of they are wavering, and we're starting to see some of these kind of splinter issues where they really are having either an aesthetic or rhetorical dislike, or aesthetic dislike for him, that the way he does things bothers them, or he is taking positions on the substance of his government that have really hurt them, or that they are concerned or worried about. We saw a lot of worry about AI, for example, and some fear that he is being too permissive of it and not interested in regulating it or protecting people from its effects. So that's a real wedge that I think that may be coming down the pike.
So I don't think you're necessarily advocating for this, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. That for the Democrats to shift a lot farther to the left, if that even paradigm is even valid anymore. But there is a contingent that says they should, right? Instead of shifting to the right, which is a lot of this common wisdom, they should go left. They should go hard left. They should go Bernie left or further. Um, and my counter argument to that is like Bernie lost to Biden in the primaries, and if they wanted
Mhm.
Bernie, like Bernie should have. If that was the case, you'd think Bernie should have won the primaries. But and I get the 2016 thing was kind of different with Hillary, but that would be my case against that. In 2020, Bernie couldn't even beat Biden. So I was curious to get some of your thoughts on that kind of meme that's out there that they should go hard left.
Sure. I think there is some argument for it. One of the things that is worth sort of tracking is the classic question, which I think is done by Pew. Should government do more, or is government doing too much? And traditionally, really since the Reagan era, we have seen that number. That's very consistently the view has been government does too much and shouldn't do so much. That's kind of the basis of the Reagan political compact. That number in the last few years has flipped, and the trajectory is going up. More and more Americans are saying government should do more. This does not necessarily mean that you need to adopt Bernie Sanders' policy position wholesale, but I think if the sort of natural instinct is, should government take a greater role? And again, we saw this. The thing that we saw most consistently, again, with the political heterodoxy of our panels last year, was people being not always, but substantially in favor of government interventions in ways that are both liberal and illiberal. The idea of government doing more pretty much across the board was sort of the order of the day, which was a fascinating finding. With specific respect to why Bernie Sanders has not didn't win 2020, and why kind of his political tendency has remained robust but not dominant within the Democratic Party. I think some of that is aesthetic, and some of it is they also, in their way, are frequently not, and certainly not everyone who subscribes to his politics or is associated with it. There's some very clear exceptions, including Zoran Mamdani and AOC, both of whom I think are kind of a different type of politician. But the sort of classic American, like the left, as represented by Bernie Sanders, has a little bit made the same mistake that the kind of center has made in terms of understanding how voters make decisions, which again is that voters are the decision to vote itself, the decision to participate in politics, and then to form a political identity and express that identity through how you vote is a much more complex process than a simple analysis of material politics. Material politics is a really important part of it. I think if we sort of went issue by issue about what I think a good policy position for an American government would be, I would come out pretty far on the left. But that's not what's going to get people to vote for you. The thing that's going to vote, the thing that matters is, what does it feel like to live in the country that you govern? And this is where Mamdani was so extraordinary. And we can debate about whether if he ran him in other parts of the country he'd win. I think he probably would, to be honest with you. But the core of his campaign, and I do want to take a second just to do a little story on that. The core of his campaign, back when he was polling below 1%, when no one had any idea who he was, right after, and even before the whole thing really began, right after the election, he was going out on the streets of New York, and he had a camera, and he was just interviewing people at subway stops. Hey, what do you think about politics? What do you think about this election? He was doing his own kind of impromptu political ethnography, asking people for these vox pops on the street. And what they said substantially informed a lot of the way he thought about this race. And there's one woman in one line that I think really kind of, to understand where his race came from and why it was so successful, you have to go back to this woman who said, "I used to love New York, and now it's just a place I live." And Mamdani took that and he flipped it. The whole campaign was about loving New York again. All right, how does it feel to live in New York? How does it feel to live in Mamdani's New York? It feels good, man. Like, it feels good because you can afford stuff. You can get the price, like your halal doesn't cost $11 that you have for lunch. It costs $8 now. And, you can go to a grocery store that works, and you can get on the bus and ride anywhere without having to pay for it. All right. All of this stuff was in the sense of like the possibility, and it was a joyful experience. And while Mamdani's story has very clear villains, including Donald Trump and billionaires and Andrew Cuomo, for the most part, it was really positive. Look at what we're going to build together. And I think to the extent that, and I don't disagree with Bernie Sanders' analysis in a substantial way, but most of his story was and could be often bogged down in being critical, understandably, but being very critical of the powerful special interests that have done this to us. He really had a very harsh and a very villain-centric story. The agency is all with the powerful special interests, the billionaires, the wealthy elite who have done this to us. Not saying he was wrong, but what does it feel like to live in Bernie Sanders' America is a different question than what does it feel like to live in Zoran Mamdani's America or AOC's America, where you have this much more sort of positive version of like, this is what this is, all of the, government expenditure, leftist politics in service of what? What does it feel like to live here? Does everyone have a place in this country? And I think the center of the party is at least as guilty as being overly cognitive in the way that it approaches talking to voters, at least as guilty as the left, if not more. And again, the whole assumption there is, well, if we just present the right policy position with the right slogan attached to it, people are going to vote for us. That's not it. You're trying to conjure values. You're trying to conjure identity. That's a much deeper process.
Well, and that's something I think that Trump is really, intuitively good at, right? I mean,
Fantastic at it. But to our damnable cost, extraordinarily good at it. Make America Great Again is a four-word story. We used to win, we don't win anymore. I will make us win again. I mean, that is an actual honest to God narrative that was resonant with people. The people he needed were already telling themselves a version of that story. He really isn't. What does it feel like to live under him? Notionally, it feels great. Because the people who did this to us are getting it in the neck, and you're getting ahead and feeling proud and feeling great about all this. It was weirdly, as hateful as a lot of those campaigns were, it was weirdly a very positive story. And the problem is now those people don't feel especially good, and the cruelty is being directed indiscriminately into the wrong people. And it's the feelings are not good anymore. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's back in such a bad spot.
Yeah, and I think both Mamdani and Trump have that risk of making a lot of promises that might be hard to keep in practice.
Yeah, I think that's true. And to a degree that you get credit for trying and you get credit for being able to tell your story. I mean, the funny thing is, Trump was reelected. When we talked to anyone, despite the fact that he was beaten, I mean, for a president to be beaten, for an incumbent president to be beaten in a fair head-to-head, there's no third-party spoiler. It was, mano a mano, and he lost. That's an extraordinary development. That almost never happens in American politics. And for a guy who lost as an incumbent to come back and win again is, genuinely extraordinary. And a big part of it was we didn't see, in any of the panels that we did in 2024, we didn't see a single reference to COVID. No one wanted to talk about it. No one thought about it. There were a couple of references in terms of like, well, things cost more since COVID. Like, you got that. But there was no reference to his governing under COVID. It's like it would all been memory hold. And you saw this in public sentiment research. The sense was, oh yeah, that guy was basically kind of okay. Like, he was, he was sort of mean and he said nasty things about people, but like he was basically fine. Just had completely suppressed how mad and unhappy everyone was from, really from August to November of 2020 is when things really, really collapsed for him. It was absolutely wild. They just completely suppressed that.
Yeah, of course, I don't want to spend the whole time about Trump, but I do have a couple of curious about a couple other things about there. But I have one sort of assertion on that. I feel like Trump could have won in a landslide if he just was a little bit less Trumpy for those 3 months. You know what I mean? He didn't. His bar wasn't that high. I mean, I think he just had to show some humanity, and he just couldn't do it. He couldn't not.
He's just not capable of it, right? We knew he was a scorpion when we picked him up. I mean, yeah, it's not in him.
So, people ask this all the time, and, I still kind of wonder about it. We talk about, like, have the Democrats sort of learned the lesson of Trump yet? Like, and exactly what does that mean? Of course, it can mean a lot of different things. But what are some of your general thoughts on that?
Such a terrific question. I'll give you a yes and no. I think we are learning. I think that's the answer to it. Excuse me. We are in the process of learning the right lessons as a political tendency, and some of it is you see particularly some elected officials. I'm thinking especially of J.B. Pritzker, but there are others who have kind of learned the lesson from this guy, which is you can't appeal to if you're going to oppose the guy, you can't appeal to better nature. You can't talk about some kind of higher ideal of, a president shouldn't conduct themselves this way. Forgive me if this is not something I can say on your program, but JB Pritzker's most recent observation is he can fuck all the way off. And and I mean that's and that kind of like blunt, crude language, which mirrors Trump substantially. That reflects, I think, a lot of where the American people are. And I think one of the mistakes, which we saw, in some of the studies that we did on democracy very early in 2024, is when the Democratic Party made these kind of, high concept appeals to like saving democracy. That just wasn't where people were. People didn't think democracy needed to be saved. They thought it needed to be fixed. And so the lesson that I hope that we as a party are beginning to learn, and you start to see more people doing this, is it's not just in how we communicate, communicating more bluntly and occasionally more crudely, but more clearly and more authentically, and with less tendency to appeal to values that no one else holds except for us. All of that reflects, I think, a larger migration away from being the party of institutions, right? Because we were that when Trump was running, we were that when Trump was in office the first time, then we were that substantially during the Biden administration. We will preserve our cherished institutions. Cherished by who
Yeah.
and for what reason? And that completely alienated us from a large portion of people because talking about, and the thing is, the work of government is really important. It's the invisible labor of government, as a friend of mine puts it, is unspeakably precious. And people are starting to understand that as well when they can't go to their national parks, so they can't do any of the other things that they would need to be able to do. Basic, the basic functions of life that government enables, or the things that we enjoy or make life easier, the government enables, have all been cut by Doge. People are starting to experience what that is like. The institutions were worth protecting. The government was important, but appealing to, the protection of institutions and institutional norms, right? Like the way we've always done things is so valuable. I think we are as a party, and when in fact people are sort of had the opposite effect. I mean, what lesson can we take from Donald Trump being a major party candidate 3 separate times and winning twice? The answer should not be people love their institutions, they love their norms, and the way they love things being done in regular order. There's clearly a constituency of the country that was howling for change, for something to be done differently, even if it's done by a bandit who's going to come in and burn the place down. So I think that is a significant evolution for the Democratic Party that I hope we are learning. I do know that there will be a tendency to look at Donald Trump's current unpopularity and to think, oh, the lesson that we take from this is people just want normal again. And so we need to go back to talking about how to respect norms and institutions and just rebuild everything that came before. And I think that would be a grave mistake. And the last thing I will say on this, and I don't know if we are learning this as a party, so I'm hoping anyone who hears this can really take this one to heart. The Democratic Party starts its story of what has gone wrong in America in the wrong place. In 2024, especially, we talked about the Democratic narrative was, Donald Trump came down the golden escalator in 2015, and after that, we've become more authoritarian, and we've lost our way, and all these bad things have happened. For the most part, the starting point for of all the people we talked to last year, different ways, the starting point for when things started to go sideways in this country, when it really started to feel like they'd lost something precious they'd lost their trust in their government, was the 1990s or the 2000s. That 20 or 30 years ago. Some people it was farther back, some people it was more recently, but substantially people date the beginning of things going sideways in this country, and we're seeing that. I'm doing another project in continental Europe. We're seeing that timeline there as well. 20 or 30 years appears to be really stuck in people's minds as a time when things were better, but then they started to unravel. We need to, as a party, understand that Trump is a symptom of what has gone wrong with our democracy, with our government, with people's lack of trust in it. And we have to reclaim that and start our story there. If we pin this on him as an individual, which we can do at the midterm to great effect, but if we pin this on him as an individual, we will not be able to rebuild the bond of trust with the voters that we have lost over the last 20 years.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very true. And and I am a little concerned. I mean, I get it, like with particularly younger generation, like they want change, but I am concerned about this kind of there's a little bit of a kind of a meme out there that like we're ready for something dramatic, maybe a king is okay kind of thinking, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I think the meme, or the idea that Gen Z are hyper conservative and prepared for the monarchy, which we were told after 2024. There's a real fear that, like, man, these kids are really conservative. That didn't really hold up. They were ready for change. I think it is interesting. But the danger, I think, that really did exist was if Trump and his administration have pursued this authoritarian plan better, if they'd just done a better job of being authoritarians, I don't like to think how much of this they might have pulled off, how much support of this they might have been able to accrue. And it may be that that's just impossible, that someone with an authoritarian impulse this strong just cannot do it gradually enough and sensibly enough to pull it off. That just might just be. I might be saying, gosh, if that pig had only tried harder, maybe it could have flown. That may just be impossible. But equally, there might have been a different way of pursuing this that was less senseless, overtly cruel, and staggeringly expensive to the American consumer, that might have netted enough political capital for them to have consolidated power in a way that could have been really uncomfortable and might have had the support to do it. Probably not a majority, but maybe a clear enough minority to be able to sustain it. That clearly was the goal, and my sense is that moment for them has probably passed. I hope it has.
Right. I mean, we still have 3 more years to find out.
Yeah, we sure do.
So you talk about this idea of showing, not telling, and so that's something I think the Democrats have always kind of faltered at. What talk me through that a little bit.
Sure. I think showing, not telling is such a good one. Again, it goes back to this question of what does your policy feel like? Who are you talking to? How do they talk about themselves? What stories are they already telling themselves? And how does your story resonate with theirs, right? Those are the big questions. And I'm going to pick on Kamala Harris a little bit here, not because she is uniquely guilty of this, but because she was prominently guilty of this for reasons that are completely understandable. When we talk about Democrats talking about economy, for example, the slogan of her campaign was, was it the opportunity economy? They want to talk about the opportunity economy. They wanted to center the middle class. These are sort of 2 turns of phrase that really kind of encapsulated all of this. Opportunity economy, center the middle class. Opportunity economy does not mean anything to anyone. It's not what does an opportunity economy feel like? What is like? How does what value does what story is your audience telling themselves? What experience of their lives are they telling that makes opportunity economy the words that will resonate with them in a way that will cause them not just to agree? Because if you say, hey, would you like an opportunity economy? No one's going to say no, but it's also not going to move them to action. It's the difference between agreement and activation. That really is the difference between telling and showing. Let me tell you what my policy is versus let me show you what it feels like to live in a country that's governed like this. So that's the problem with the opportunity economy. Centering the middle class, leaving aside even the choice to use the word centering, which I have some time for the argument that it's a little bit of an academic or sort of activist term that is not commonly understood to mean what they think it means in normal parlance. But even leaving that to one side, the middle class, as we discovered in our research last year, and this is a term, those 2 words put together in a political context are fraught with doubt, distrust, and distress. People do not react well to hearing those words in a political context, not because they dislike the middle class, they like the middle class, but because to them, in a political context, it feels disingenuous and manipulative because, in fact, no one lives in the kind of middle class that is meant to be evoked by these by this language, right? Like, if you wanted to take a family, then we've talked about all this. I know you've talked about this with other people. We talk about this a lot in the discourse. The simple, fact of it is the cost of a comfortable life in this country. So, all of the things that you associate with the middle class, some discretionary spending, security, all of that stuff. The cost of a comfortable life in this country has doubled in the last 20 years, literally doubled. And, the idea of talking about, we want to center the middle class. Who is the middle class anymore? The middle class are worried about falling out of the middle class. Like the idea of strengthening and shoring it up, it's just too fraught a term. But, there it was on day, I think it was day 3 of the Democratic National Convention, everyone out with their placards, middle class, middle class. What does it feel like to live in a country that is governed by a Democratic president on Democratic principles? Do you feel less worried? Do you feel free? Do you feel do you feel financially free? Do you feel like if something goes wrong, you're going to be okay, that you can provide for your family, that you will never be forced to work a job that you dislike, for people that disrespect you? The concept of respect in the economy, I think, is something that we haven't really fully explored yet. It's something we saw a lot, and I don't think makes its way into political communication enough. Does it feel like if something happens, you won't have to work in a job that pays you too little, that works you too hard, that takes you away from the people that you care about, and then where you are disrespected, that you won't have to worry about that at all, that you know you have the financial freedom to be yourself and to spend time with the people you care about and to, to enlarge yourself through travel or just through hanging out with your family, right? Does it feel like that? And a candidate who really does this well is Lula, president of Brazil. Gave a fantastic speech when he was running. I come back to this all the time where he talked about how Bolsonaro and his people don't understand us, don't want us to live the way we know our goal. What we just want is on a Friday afternoon, we just want to grill a steak and go out on the street and grill a steak and drink a beer and dance with our neighbors. And that's who we are. And it's a very simple, like that's what Lula's presidency was meant to feel like. The knowledge that that Friday afternoon was going to come and you'd be able to do all those things without, a bunch of armed jackboots taking down your neighborhood or without beer and steak being so expensive you couldn't afford to do those things, right? How does it feel to live in the country that's governed by that, but on that basis? And as a party, the Democratic Party has a horrible tendency to completely miss that element in the way that we communicate.
Well, and I guess that's one place we can wrap up with. What would be your, I agree in the sense that a lot of times Democrats seem really wonky, and like you say, they
Mm-hmm.
use words that people don't really like. They're too conceptual, and have all these implied meanings, but not everybody really gets the meaning. Whereas, like you say, I mean, a lot of these good candidates can just simplify it, like just baseline, right? Nice, simple language. So, what would be some of your, maybe advice or and particularly I'm speaking to the people that are sort of frustrated with both parties, and sort of thinking about opting out. So, what's something that the Democratic Party can do to, appeal to those people and give them a reason to vote?
I mean, what this party needs to do, and there are people in it who are doing this, and I hope we do it more. The problem, it seems to me, is that there are a lot of people, as you say, the people who are opting out of politics, who feel like the party doesn't understand, feel like politics, not just the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party substantially, doesn't understand the experience of what they've been going through. They just don't get it. They don't understand how hard things are for ordinary people, for regular people, what we used to call the middle class, but anyone now. They don't understand how hard things are. Uh, aren't honest about whether or not they have a plan for it and what it will take to fix it, and aren't accountable for the failures of those for failure when those plans occur. Right? That I think is ultimately the root of this is this absence of empathy, this absence of honesty, and this absence of accountability. And I think if you want to appeal to people, for me, if you have any political stripe, but you've got to get back to those three things, right? Like understand, begin with an active listening exercise to understand like the way people live. And I'll give you a small example of this, but I referenced it earlier in the Gen Z Latinos. We were called into that project because a lot of the polling that our client was terrific, extraordinarily inquisitive, incredibly imaginative, really really privileged to have worked with them. They had polling that showed that the Gen Z kids they were talking to, and forgive me, I keep calling them kids. They seem like kids to me. These are
Right.
adults. They're grown folk. I got to stop calling them kids. But the Gen Z folks were worried about housing. That kept coming up on their polling, and so they would send their canvassers. Our client would send their canvassers out, and they had rent. They're Gen Z. They usually rent, so we're going to have discussion of lowering the rent. And the canvassers kept coming back with they don't seem to care about that at all. What gives? So they brought us in, and what we discovered is it wasn't rent at all. They did think the rent was too high. They were interested in having help on that, but it was that inability to see their future as represented by owning their own home. Right? You've got to go back and do that kind of active listening to understand where your people are, what are their life experiences, because what we will find is, and I'll give you another small example on this. When people express worry about AI, we are, as a Democratic Party, primed to talk about, oh yeah, data centers are going to come and they're going to suck up all the water, they're going to raise your power bill. It's a very material politics argument. They're going to take all your jobs. AI is going to take your job. Those are all worries, and we should be serious about them and talk about them. But there's also a sort of there's also a sense, I think, and we just have recently seen this, a sense of like lingering dread about the idea of yet more faceless, unaccountable machines guiding our lives. Right? So that sense of like, there's no empathy, there's no honesty, and there's no accountability in an AI. You can't you don't have that opportunity to make that human connection. So as a party, we need to listen and understand that like a lot of the AI worry isn't a material worry about the cost of power or about although that is real. but it's about the sort of feeling of that our world is being taken over by these weird faceless things that we don't understand, corporations in tech that we really kind of resent or dislike. So understand that experience, do that active listening, so you can meet people with empathy. You can be honest with them about about how you think this should be handled, because people will let you disagree with them if they understand the values that underlie your answer. Be honest about it, and then be accountable to it. And honestly, tell people, this is what I'm going to do, and if I don't, you should vote. You should vote me out. We're going to be ruthlessly honest with you about this stuff, because everyone arranges facts to fit a narrative. There's nothing wrong with, or to fit a story, to fit a message. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But we are in a position now, I think, where people are so fed up with crisis of government that really hanging a lantern on accountability for a party and for the people who work for it and for it within government, I think, is more important than it's ever been. So I would say go back to empathy, go back to honesty, go back to accountability for yourself, and you probably won't go wrong.
Hmm. Interesting. I mean, I think this accountability is what everybody kind of wants, but it's hard to feel like you're getting any because your only option is to vote people out. Like that's like the only accountability that we have. And often our options aren't very good. And so even if you don't, you have to either pick, it's that holding your nose thing. And sometimes you go back to this incumbent because the other person you feel is even worse, farther away.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, look at what's happening in the Labour Party in the UK. I mean, they won the biggest election in 70 years last year. Therefore, they are in horrible political shape now, because they were voted out because people were really tired of the Conservatives. But it is a very, very short leash now, and I think. And then I'm not speaking to that case, about what accountability would look like very specifically in that country, but you need some you need some internal accountability. And what tends to happen in government is you get in, you see how hard it is to do these things, you see how long it will take, how expensive it is, and you start making excuses. And you start messaging to people and kind of asking for them to understand why you can't do things rather than doing them. And and what we have
Yeah.
to do is become comfortable with breaking stuff and breaking norms or breaking rules, and holding ourselves internally accountable to this. Can we do this? And if not, do we deserve to be here? And it's an incredibly uncomfortable. Basically, what I'm saying is commit to being uncomfortable, not just on the campaign trail, but through the totality of your time in government, because you're always going to be pushing yourself. And I think if we can do that, I think we might have a shot at regaining some of that trust.
Yeah, and I think that's one other thing people sort of like. I mean, maybe not like isn't quite the right word. Maybe they respect it in some way about Trump because he does stuff. He breaks rules and he does stuff.
Oh yeah, and he's perceived at doing that, and he's also perceived at holding people accountable because he spent years telling people they were fired, right? Like if you sort of think about it, he's like the decades that he spent building his brand and his narrative were perfect for what people were looking for in 2016, and then again in 2024. And yeah, he does break stuff. I mean, and that's clearly the lesson. Like people want someone who is not going to be hidebound by institutions. It's worth pointing out, and I know we've been talking for a while, but Trump is 2-1 against Democratic presidential candidates. He is 15-0 against Republican presidential candidates
Right.
because he refused to even dignify them. Just absolutely scorned them and read them for filth from the moment he started until the moment he was inaugurated both times. And like that sense of like not pretending that things that are obviously crap aren't crap really got him a long way with his own voters. And I think we need to start seeing more of that, because there has been a lot. My party has certainly been very, very guilty of it, of looking at things that are obviously crap or probably trending toward crap and being like, well, this is actually really good because of this complicated reason. And it doesn't fly, man. And you lose trust and you lose resonance. And it's just a bad deal. It's no way to govern. It's no way to relate to people.
Yeah, that's like when your cable company raises your rates and tries to explain to you how it's a win for you.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. We're recommitting that to whatever, man. Come on now.
Yeah. Well, Frank Spring, I really appreciate you making time for our program. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thanks for having me.